So what does that imply in terms of sensitivity to threat? Well, the world's a more dangerous place for women. Why else? Well, they're sexually vulnerable in a way that men aren't. And that makes itself present, obviously, at puberty. Why are they more sexually vulnerable? Here's the definition of a woman. We know the answer to that. It isn't chromosomal, even biologically. No, chromosome differentiation is a very powerful marker of sex, but it's not the fundamental distinction. The fundamental biological distinction between male and female is quite clear. Females are the sex that contribute more to reproduction. So, for example, the egg is 10 million times the volume of the sperm. And so right at that level, the initial level of conception, the female is already making the larger sacrifice. So there's a definition of a woman. A woman is the sex who makes the larger sacrifice for reproduction. Now, you have to be a fool to dispute that, obviously. Women carry babies, like they're pregnant, and they take primary responsibility for infants when they're in their most dependent stage. That puts them at a disadvantage socioeconomically. It's difficult, differentially difficult for women to maneuver in the world when they're pregnant or when they have dependent infants. So what does that mean with regards to mate choice? It means that they look for men who are capable of keeping the predators who might prey on infants and them at bay, productive and generous. And so women look for markers of social status to index attractiveness. Why? Because they outsource the problem of who's the better man to the men. And they let them compete and they peel from the top. And it's a brilliant strategy. So, why do women reject men? Well, I just told you why. And so that might be very irritating. If you're rejected, it is very irritating. There's probably nothing worse in a sense, but like how in the world could it be any different? Because the stakes are high. So women are more sensitive to negative emotion and they're more empathic and agreeable. What does that mean? Why is that? Well, we talked about some of the reasons. Why else? Because they have to care for dependent infants. So here's the rule for caring for an infant up to about 7 months old. Whatever the infant wants goes, right? An infant in distress is never wrong. Now, you can't say that about a creature of any other age, right? Once children are capable of moving, crawling even, they're not entirely dependent, and every single demand for gratification they make manifest does not have to be met with immediate, what would you say? Does not have to be addressed immediately at the cost of everything. It's not the case with infants 6 months and lower. Whatever they need and want now, that's what's to be provided, right? And so women are tilted towards that kind of care. Okay, what does that mean in the biblical context? Adam's role is to name and subdue, to establish order. What's the problem with establishing order? You might leave something out. Women are the voice of that which is being left out. Well, what does that mean? Well, you know what it means. If you've had a family, if you're in a marriage, women bring the attention of men to the concerns of the vulnerable. And you know, if you have a family and you have 2 kids and then you have a 3rd baby, the family's already settled into a kind of stable order, let's say. But now you have this new infant and it's a completely new creature and it's got a new temperament. God only knows what it's up to. It's an extremely complicated creature. And there has to be adjustments made to the structure of order so that that child can find its place. And the women are in contact with that, and their emotional makeup and perceptual structure, they're better at decoding nonverbal behavior, for example, than men are. That enables them to speak for the marginalized. Right. That accounts, in large part, for the political divide between men and women that you can see growing. What's the sin of women? Amongst the marginalized are the serpentine. Right? Not everybody who cries victim is an infant. Some of the creatures that cry victim are monsters, and you shouldn't clutch them to your breast. That's what Eve does with the snake. She clutches the serpentine to her breast. Why? To announce to herself the supreme power of her compassion. Right? That's the pattern. That's the eternal pattern of female sin as laid out in the second story in the biblical corpus. What's the sin of men? Adam. Because he falls immediately after Eve. Eve hearkens to the voice of the serpent, who is the immediate manifestation of the Luciferian spirit of the usurper and the deceiver. That's the mythological structure. What does that mean? Psychopaths use victim status to gain what they want. Right? And prideful, compassionate fools fall for it. Why? To elevate their compassion to the highest place. Not a wise move. What's Adam's sin? What do men want? They want to impress women. I worked with lawyers for years, high-end lawyers, people who ran law firms, who were partners of senior law firms, and they made a lot of money. $1,000 an hour, a lot of money. Why were they interested in the money? Well, there are materialistic reasons for being interested in money. We don't have to cover them. But most of them regarded the money, especially their bonuses, as, what did they say? That's how we keep score. What did that mean? Well, that was how the men rank ordered themselves in the status hierarchy within the firms. And that's very common among men. They're rank ordering status all the time. Why? Because women peel from the top. The biggest predictor of a woman's attractiveness to a man's attractiveness to a woman cross-culturally is his comparative status among other men. It's a walloping predictor. It's by far the biggest contributor. And we said, why? Well, why? Well, because a woman doesn't need another infant, right? She needs someone who can help. And how does she find out? Well, she sees who wins the contest among men, and she assumes that the winner is the winner. And so why not have him? And it's a perfectly reasonable way of conducting an analysis. It can be gamed. But that's a different story. So what's Adam's sin? He tries to impress Eve. So when she comes to him announcing her new relationship with the serpentine, he says, no problem, dear, whatever you want, and fails to establish the proper borders of order. What happens? That's the fall of mankind. Okay, so what does that mean? It's a very complicated idea. There's a Christian idea, deep Christian idea, that suffering is the consequence of sin, and that the worst sin, let's say, is the sin of pride. Adam and Eve both fall prey to the sin of pride, in the feminine way and the masculine way. Adam says, I got this, baby. And Eve says, we can even clutch the serpent to our breasts. Right. That's their typical forms of pathology. What happens to people who bite off more than they can chew? What happens to people who attempt to incorporate and digest the inedible? They fall. That's what happens to Adam and Eve. Pride comes before a fall. Okay, so what does that have to do with suffering? That's a complicated question, right? Because you might think, and rightly so, that suffering itself seems to be built into the structure of the world, right? I mean, we're fragile. We can be hurt. Our children are hurt. They stumble. They scrape their knees. They break their arms and legs. They develop terrible diseases like we all do. There seems to be an element of suffering and vulnerability built into the world. What else causes suffering? Biting off more than you can chew, right? So you imagine how many times you're struggling forward in disenchanted misery because you've fallen away from what you should pursue because you've falsely aggrandized yourself or taken on a task, claimed to be able to take on a task or to have a skill that you don't possess. Setting yourself up for a fall. What's the consequence of that? Misery. How much of the misery of the world is that? That's a real interesting question. You know, we actually don't know, right? We've established, let's say in the course of this dialogue, that there's a certain amount of suffering that's a mere consequence of the structure of the world, the arbitrary nature of reality, you know, the sort of random distribution of vulnerability and illness. But by the same token, man, you can do a lot of stupid things to make your life worse. And so you got to ask yourself, if you stop doing those stupid things and you aimed in the proper direction, how much of the suffering that's attendant on life would vanish? And the answer is, well, quite a lot, because you know that when you're doing your best, when you have your act together, when you're not pridefully overreaching, when you're not overextending yourself, when you're not acting falsely, when you're not trying to usurp and claim what's not yours, when you're not trying to be the pinnacle of the moral order, let's say, life's a lot better.